It's time once again for my yearly update on the journey to find obscure films from one of my favorite directors, Nobuhiko Obayashi. In my last video, I commented on how a few more films from the man's filmography resurfaced, as well as English subtitles which didn't previously exist. That was a big step forward, but that is nothing compared to what has happened since then. As of right now, nearly every feature film from Nobuhiko Obayashi has come to the surface, albeit without English subtitles for most of them. This includes not only the movies I'm going to be talking about in this video, but also One Summer's Day, the Oida trilogy, the Tomcat Holmes duology, Lover Come Back to Me, the Nagaharu Yodogawa story, The Stupid Teacher, The Strange Pair, So Long the movie, I Want to Hear the Wind Song, and Farewell. As you can see, the films also all have English subtitles now too, which is great because you don't have to hear me butcher the Japanese language anymore. Beyond that, other developments include new subtitles for all of Obayashi's experimental shorts, one of which I'm going to be talking about in this video. Another project of Obayashi's that has bubbled to the surface, and this is a big one I'm honestly shocked I never heard about before, is a 9-part radio drama based on his very first movie, House. Released in 1976, the House radio drama actually predates the movie's release in 1977, despite the fact it features a lot of the same music and sound clips that would be featured in the film. I can't say how closely it follows the film's story since there are no subtitles available for it yet, but this is a huge discovery. Not only does this offer more context to one of my favorite films that I was unaware of before, but this is a whole other format of Obayashi's art, the likes of which I've never seen. Or heard. I'd be very interested in tackling this one at a later date. With that said, there's still a lot of content from Obayashi we have yet to find. The only one of his known full features that I have not been able to get my hands on yet is 1990's Why Won't She Marry? From my understanding, that film had a limited VHS release and was never on DVD, thus making tracking it down very tricky. Aside from that, there are also shorter projects like his really early short films from when he was a teenager, such as Popeye's Treasure Island, The Stupid Teacher, and many more which have still not resurfaced. I still don't know what the TV project Hito wa Sore wo Scandal to Iu is, or how to find it, and on top of that, there are plenty of commercials that he directed that are probably lost to time forever. I also recently found a credit on Letterboxd for a making of behind-the-scenes documentary of Casting Blossoms to the Sky, which was probably released as a DVD extra for that film. I personally would really be interested in seeing that considering how much I loved Obayashi's Making of Dreams documentary. With all that out of the way, now it's time to talk about the content I can actually analyze due to having English subtitles readily available. This includes 3 feature films, one 50-minute made-for-television special, and an experimental film from Obayashi's early years which we can better contextualize with the added subtitles. As a bonus, at the end of the video, I'll also delve into a little mystery surrounding the movie Samurai Kids, which I haven't brought up previously. And one last thing before we get into the reviews, I want to give a huge thanks to all the people in the OK Fine Be That Way Discord server, which have been a huge help in discovering and curating a lot of this information. I can safely say that I wouldn't have nearly as much information at this point in time if it wasn't for the awesome community of people who are also passionate about bringing this information to the public. Come join in on the fun via our Discord link in the description, and for now, let's delve into the 4th installment of Nobuhiko Obayashi Reviews. In part 2 of my Obayashi retrospective, I talked a lot about his various short films, most of which did not have English subtitles aside from Emotion, and later in part 3, Foreign Correspondent, The Case of a Filmmaker. That is no longer the case as subtitles for these shorts have since been created by Jingi Minami Subs. Since many of these short films were pretty light on dialogue anyway, it's still very possible to get the gist of what was happening without subs. Therefore, there's not much of a reason for me to go back and cover them again. That is with the exception of Confession from 1968, which did have its fair share of dialogue. Thankfully, since the sub situation has been rectified, it's time to finally go back and give the movie the review it deserves. First off, even though it's categorized with Obayashi's other experimental short films, Confession clocks in at 72 minutes long, so calling it a short is debatable. In a way, you could consider this to be Obayashi's first feature-length film that predates even House, even though it wasn't backed by a studio. It's also worth noting that this is the last film from Obayashi's experimental era, with the exception of Foreign Correspondent, which was done more in a half-documentary style rather than his previously avant-garde approach. Confession is, in a lot of ways, a landmark in Obayashi's career and represents the end of an era and the beginning of a new one, both in terms of its timing and the themes of the movie itself. Prior to obtaining subtitles for Confession, the way that most outlets described it was as a series of vignettes featuring the residents of Onomichi. While that synopsis is true on a very basic level, watching the film with subtitles adds a lot more context to that description. Essentially, Confession is a piece that mixes real stories from Obayashi's life with fictionalized characters and situations. It very much is an exploration of Onomichi's youth in the 60s, told in both a semi-autobiographical and extremely heightened manner. The movie takes place over several years, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was comprised of different footage filmed over those years as well. It's also possible that Obayashi filmed a lot of these sequences for unrelated projects and then compiled them together in Confession to create a narrative for them to fit together. Obayashi himself appears in the film, along with his wife who is featured heavily. Several scenes feature Obayashi monologuing about how he met his wife, the development of their relationship into marriage, and eventually the birth of their daughter who appears near the end. We know for a fact that these were real events that were occurring in Obayashi's life around this time, and these scenes kind of act as a framing device around everything else that happens in Confession. From there, the movie delves into a bunch of vignettes featuring different characters, who are far too numerous and often abstract to fully recount, unless I wanted this review to be twice as long as the movie itself. In short, many of these different stories cover themes of youth, time, death, love, loss, tragedy, and comedy, all of which were the type of things Obayashi would delve into frequently, both in his previous and later outings. It's very fitting that this is Obayashi's final experimental effort, since a lot of the themes here represent the transition from youth into becoming an adult, which mirrors the end of his experimental journey and the beginning of his professional career directing commercials. I'm a big fan of movies which intersplice reality and fiction, and the way that Confession approaches this is quite interesting. A lot of the characters within the story are fully aware that they are in a film. They mug and pose for the camera, and at many points, you see them surrounded by other characters with equipment filming those scenarios. This creates a level of surrealism where the actors are playing characters who are playing actors who are playing characters who are aware that they are in a film, which is something Obayashi would later again explore in his final film, Labyrinth of Cinema. The way this device is used in Confession is really fascinating because the movie is essentially about Obayashi's own youth, which, obviously, consisted of him making experimental short films in Onomichi. Thus, Confession using this approach is a great commentary not only on his personal experiences, but the way that he used art, particularly filmmaking and storytelling, to express his deeper emotions. This is a trait that can be respected by many artists, both aspiring and established, and really cements Obayashi as someone who understood the art form of film and the value of expressing yourself. Even if Obayashi's films aren't to your personal taste, you can never accuse him of not being true to his vision. This is also a movie that relies heavily on contrast in a lot of areas. There's the contrast between fiction and reality in the narrative, the contrast between black and white and sharp colors in certain scenes, the contrast of characters acting light and bouncy while delivering extremely depressing dialogue or narration, or, on the flip side, really depressing imagery while upbeat music plays. There's even a contrast between live action and animation, with certain scenes being animated in a cutout Monty Python style. It's because of this that Confession feels like sensory overload, which is quite clearly its intent. I have to admit, out of all the different projects I've covered from Obayashi's lineage, Confession is probably the hardest one I've ever had to talk about. I've watched it 4 times now, twice without subtitles and twice with them, and even now I'm struggling to articulate what I even want to say about it in a review. While I think there's a lot I didn't pick up on and who's to say I ever will, I do get more out of the experience every time I return to it. It's obviously not for everyone considering this was never intended as a mainstream movie, but I enjoyed putting the pieces of this puzzle together, and I think a lot of other Obayashi fans will too in the coming years. Confession works both as an experimental piece and as an artist expressing his inner emotions. As it stands, the added subtitles perpetuate Confession to being my all-new favorite quote-unquote short film that Obayashi made in the 60s. April Fish, possibly known better by its French title Poison d'Avril, was released in 1986. The title is apparently a pun in French that means April Fools and April Fish, I think. According to the film, the April Fish is something that is sold in France on April 1st. The movie also opens with a song in French called Poison d'Avril, which is accompanied by Japanese subtitles, so I guess that's a big thing over there. The more you know. The plot involves a filmmaker named Shohei who is working in commercials. Disenchanted by his current position, Shohei is experiencing a creative lull and is looking to break into directing his own films. He sees his opportunity when he finds out that a wealthy producer named Chief Panapora from the South Seas, who Shohei worked with years ago, is coming to visit Japan. In order to impress the chief, Shohei agrees to set up a fancy French dinner at his apartment and hires an aspiring actress named Mari to roleplay as his wife, all while Shohei's real wife is busy working on a project of her own. There are a few notable things that stick out to me based on that premise, not the least which being the character of Shohei himself. The concept of a director working for television commercials while trying to branch off into feature films undoubtedly has to mirror the experience of Nobuhiko Obayashi himself, who did the exact same thing for many years until landing his big break with House. As much as I enjoy Obayashi's commercial work, I did always kind of imagine that directing hundreds, if not thousands, of advertisements over a 10-year period must have had its strenuous days, especially for someone who clearly wanted to express himself through features. This is also one of Obayashi's movies where he's credited as a co-writer, so I'm willing to bet that many of his personal experiences and past emotions made their way into the script. At the same time, Obayashi and his co-writers never bogged down the movie with too much melodrama, and wisely used the comedy as a way to highlight the absurdity of situations happening to the characters. Another thing that sticks out to me about the premise is that it almost sounds like a sitcom plot. I mean, a guy hires a young girl to pretend to be his wife and prepares a fancy dinner in order to impress a movie producer while his real wife isn't around? I could easily see this as being a plot for a Seinfeld episode if you change around the characters and motivations a little bit. It might sound like I'm bashing April Fish by saying this, but I'm actually not. I'm a firm believer that the premise for something doesn't matter nearly as much as what you do with it, and April Fish being a clear satire of the type of tropes you'd find on TV, works great in a story about creatively burnt-out characters who work in that industry. The first half or so of this film involves Shohei getting ready for the upcoming meeting, and the second half is about the dinner itself and all the shenanigans that take place. For the most part, the movie uses very limited sets, although there are a few shots that take place outdoors. Some of the sets remind me of the ones you'd find in other Obayashi projects like Take Me Away or The Deserted City, which makes me believe they were repurposed for this project. By far the most prominent set is that of Shohei's apartment, especially in the second half of the film, which takes place almost exclusively in that area. When you make a movie like this that doesn't have that many locations, it's a good idea to use the sets you do have to their fullest advantage. Obayashi certainly gets the most out of what he has by making the environments dense, while still giving the actors enough room to act out some pretty great physical comedy. The limited sets also do well with the sitcom satire, especially in the 80s when sitcoms generally didn't have that many locations at their disposal. This director has made a lot of great films that tackle the subject of people making movies, such as Confession, Legend of the Cat Monster, or Labyrinth of Cinema. But April Fish, I believe, is the first movie I've seen from him that really tackles the television and commercial industry. Even if you didn't know the context behind Obayashi's personal experiences in those fields, the movie is so funny and somewhat insightful that it'll be able to keep the viewer entertained throughout. The performances from all the main cast members are comedically on point, and the occasional slapstick combined with the dialogue-heavy comedy really works. I will say that I did think the first half of the movie was a little bit too exposition-heavy for my taste, but even then, there are a lot of really funny moments and it's worth it to build up to the second half. It starts off comedic but in a somewhat grounded way, and becomes sillier and more cartoony as it continues. As far as the directing goes, April Fish certainly isn't one of Obayashi's flashiest movies, but there are certainly a few interesting choices here and there, such as his decision to take out certain frames in a few scenes to give a feeling of swift movement. As a result, this is a very performance-heavy movie that relies heavily on its writing and acting, both areas which are covered well. Overall, April Fish is a smart and funny movie that touches on the motivations of artists, French cuisine, and genuine relationship issues. The comedy is definitely the focus, but it also works as a character study with some insight to the television industry of the 80s in Japan. I wouldn't go as far as to call it one of my favorite Obayashi movies, or even my favorite comedy that he's made, but I did find it very entertaining, and appreciated the unique angle from which it approached its story. There are some slow moments here and there, but I feel it really makes up for it with the scenes where the comedy is really shining, which I would say is about 80% of the time. That's a higher ratio than most movies and makes for another solid entry in Obayashi's filmography. My Heart Belongs to Daddy is another made-for-television film from Obayashi. At this point, I'm actually convinced the man directed more made-for-TV films than he did theatrical outings, but who knows. The story follows a high school student named Mimiko who, following the death of her mother, moves in with her estranged father Konuma. From there, the movie follows their relationship as Konuma desperately tries to connect with his daughter, while Mimiko adapts to her new environment and overcoming the trauma of losing her mother. From that description, it may sound like this movie is pretty somber, and thematically it is. However, something you may have realized is that when it comes to Obayashi, the plot descriptions for his films don't necessarily represent the tone that you will see on screen, as the director is very fond of using contrast. Thus, My Heart Belongs to Daddy is another comedy from the director, and a damn funny one at that. It also definitely contains some very dramatic moments, which makes you feel for the characters, especially Mimiko, who is hugely sympathetic. I appreciate how Obayashi's comedies are not simply light and breezy laugh fests, even when they are hilarious. They all have stories and characters which they use to make a point, regardless of whatever the tone is. If this was a straight-up drama, the story would still be interesting and work on its own, and the fact that it's really funny doesn't detract from that in the slightest. The core of this movie is Mimiko's emotional journey, particularly regarding her relationship with her father. Konuma from the get-go is portrayed as a bumbling buffoon who, through his apparent negligence, has not been present in Mimiko's life for the last 15 years. In the opening scene, he doesn't even recognize his own daughter when he goes to pick her up at the train station, which is a great way of establishing the type of person he is. A lot of Konuma's journey throughout the movie follows him learning to be a better father, even through his flaws and shortcomings. The movie also touches on the generational gaps found between two characters, which leads them to misunderstanding each other even further. Without spoiling anything, we also learn near the end of the film that Konuma may not have been as incompetent as the audience and Mimiko initially thinks he is. The movie does a great job at building on Konuma's character and making him multi-layered so that we can both laugh at and sympathize with him at the same time. On the other side of things, we have Mimiko, who's really the focus of the story. She's clearly in a fragile mental state due to the recent tragedy in her life, on top of going through a huge adaptation process with her father, who she doesn't respect. At many points in the movie, Mimiko is seen having internal dialogues where she expresses her deeper emotions, often through some sort of monologue. These scenes are by far the most interesting points of the movie visually, as Obayashi uses a lot of creative techniques to his advantage. Sometimes, the entire world will freeze except for Mimiko so that she can deliver a speech. Kind of like an episode of The Weekenders. Wow, I can't believe I just referenced The Weekenders in an Obayashi review. Other times, Mimiko's reflection in a mirror will do the talking, while Mimiko herself performs her regular tasks. There are even moments where Mimiko talks to herself Gollum style, or the movie turns into a straight-up animation during transitional scenes. It's implied that whenever Mimiko is really upset, she escapes into a fantasy world, and the comedy within the movie feels like a defense mechanism that she uses to deal with her issues. Beyond that, My Heart Belongs to Daddy uses a lot of other techniques to its advantage, which range from looping dialogue, drastic contrasts in perspective, color and lighting clashes, and quick cuts in the editing. I really appreciate how the film doesn't stick to one method in this regard, and tries its hardest to be creative and varied in its presentation. Even with a restricted made-for-TV budget, My Heart Belongs to Daddy is a lot more visually stimulating than it really needed to be, and it makes it all that much better as a result. It does, however, make me wish we get a higher resolution version available someday, as the rip I found was in pretty low quality. Mimiko and Konuma aren't the only characters in this story, however, as Mimiko often talks to her best friend Yohei and Professor Tagawa about her issues. This leads to a interesting storyline where Yohei and Tagawa hook up and become a couple. As scummy as he is, Tagawa is probably the funniest secondary character in the movie, as he gets a lot of great lines and has good chemistry with the rest of the cast. Frequent Obayashi actor Toshinori Omi also appears in the movie as well, and he does a great job as usual. We're later introduced to a woman named Yoshie, who rivals Tagawa as the funniest secondary character. The movie has a lot to say about Japanese culture and the different expectations of youth and middle-aged men, especially when it comes to interpersonal relationships. Part of the reason I like foreign movies is because it feels like a window into another culture, especially in the case of many Japanese films. Not knowing the intricacies of said culture may prove as a barrier for some, but I find it educational and fascinating. The title My Heart Belongs to Daddy comes from the classic musical number of the same name. While the number was originally written for the 1938 Broadway musical Leave It to Me, the song is arguably best known due to Marilyn Monroe's cover from the 1960 film Let's Make Love. Monroe's cover plays a few times throughout the film, and thematically has purpose given the context of the story. The reaction I've seen to My Heart Belongs to Daddy based on its initial Letterboxd reviews has been pretty lukewarm, which kind of surprised me. I think the movie works well both comedically and dramatically, has really fun and dynamic filmmaking choices, very solid acting, and a good exploration of its themes. I like how so much of the movie is focused on Mimiko's perspective and how it changes as the story progresses. The other characters are a lot of fun too, and the way their zaniness bounces off of Mimiko's grounded nature is a perfect dynamic. In terms of Obayashi's straight-up comedies, I would say that My Heart Belongs to Daddy is not quite on the level of The Adventures of Kosuke Kindaichi, but I liked it more than April Fish. I'd put it somewhere in the middle of Obayashi's catalog, but in my opinion, that still makes for a pretty great and entertaining experience. Turning Point, also known as A Mature Woman, and referred to in the movie's opening credits as Turning Point or The Adventure of Yumiko Minami, is a movie based off of a novel by Saichi Maruya. It was released theatrically in Japan on June 18th, 1994, which, wouldn't you know it, is one day after I was born. Actually, taking the time zone differences into consideration, it was actually the same day depending on how you want to look at it. I'm gonna take that into account just to say I was kind of born on the same day as an Obayashi movie. Here all I thought my birthday had going for it was O.J. Simpson's Bronco Chase, Jack Nicholson's Wolf, and getting even with Dad. Anyway, before I get too excited about that, let's talk about the plot of the movie. Turning Point follows the story of Yumiko Minami, a middle-aged Tokyo-based woman who, after working for over 20 years as a journalist, is finally promoted to a new position in the editorial board. On the surface, this seems to be Yumiko's dream job, but she quickly learns that the position is not all that she hoped it would be. Generally speaking, I tend to watch these Obayashi movies at least twice before making a review, so that I can make my thoughts and opinions on the experience much clearer and more solidified. I'm especially happy that I took this approach with Turning Point because the movie branches off into a million different directions and subplots that covers everything from politics, to infidelity, to the role of a woman in Japanese society, to chimpanzee penises. No, I'm not kidding about that last one. The title Turning Point has a double meaning in this case, as it not only refers to Yumiko's new job position, but also how the narrative of the movie changes focus rather than being bound to a regular 3-act structure. It could also refer to Yumiko's perspective on life constantly changing as she experiences these events. So perhaps the title has a triple meaning, or even a quadruple meaning. This film is a bit of a puzzle to review. On the one hand, I can see why many people might find it dull or slow. This is a very dialogue-heavy outing from Obayashi, and if you're not invested into the story, then it probably won't be your thing, especially since there are so many characters and plot lines to follow. The movie also touches on a lot of the intricacies of Japanese culture, particularly male-dominated workplaces and the sensationalism found in a lot of journalism. If you're a Westerner, you may find these concepts hard to gravitate towards, and even if you are Japanese, the issues this film tackles are from what the contemporary perspective was back in the 90s. Obviously, newspaper journalism changed significantly since then, with the internet becoming much more popular than print, and even a lot of the political and social issues brought up in the movie may or may not still be applicable. I'm not Japanese, nor do I follow politics in general, so I can't really say one way or the other. What I can say though is that I personally found this work to be both interesting as a time capsule, and as a window into another culture. Plus, certain topics like sensationalism in journalism is something that's pretty universal and still applies to modern society, so there is still a level of relatability. Turning Point, like I've said, is extremely dialogue heavy, but that's not to say the movie doesn't offer much visually, because that couldn't be further from the truth. The style of movie this is, and particularly the editing, play a big part in the storytelling, to the point if you were to look at the script, or even read the original novel it's based off of, I imagine you would be getting a whole different experience. The thing is, the movie doesn't really contain many special effects or crazy camera angles. However, it really manages to be visually stimulating because it only really stays on a single shot for about 3 to 5 seconds before cutting to a different perspective in the scene. It may not sound like much from the description, but the quick editing really gives the movie a frantic and fast-paced feeling, which makes it much more engaging than it would be otherwise. Eventually, the movie uses its editing style to play with time, where half of the shots will be Yumiko in one location, and the other half of the shots will be her in another place, all within the same scene. Somehow the movie manages to make the transitions feel natural in a weird way, much more impressive than a simple flashback. A movie this dialogue heavy runs the risk of being boring, and a movie with this many cuts runs the risk of being disorienting. Obayashi manages to strike a perfect balance between the two in an enthralling, subtle, and effective way. The cinematography is also done in a handheld guerrilla style, akin to the type of thing you'd find in a news broadcast, which makes sense given the subject of the movie. Obayashi makes good use of the foreground, middle ground, and background in all of the shots. There's also a good use of color that can range from warm or cold, depending on the situation. I especially like the nighttime shots and a lot of the landscape shots near the end. The newsroom is also very busy and claustrophobic, which gives a great sense of the environment. The acting in the movie all across the board deserves a lot of praise, especially in a really dialogue-heavy movie like this where it rides off the believability of the characters. Near the beginning of the film, one of the characters recalls something that happened to them on the way to a Joe Hisaishi concert, who is the same man who composed the score of this movie. If you don't know who that is, Joe Hisaishi is a famous Japanese film composer behind the scores of many Obayashi's other movies, such as The Drifting Classroom, Chizuko's Younger Sister, Haruka Nostalgia, and Samurai Kids. He's probably best known and celebrated as being the composer behind every single one of Hayao Miyazaki's films, with the exception of The Castle of Cagliostro, and he's also worked on the score for many of Kitashi Kitano's films as well. Calling him one of the most prolific Japanese composers of all time is an understatement. I'm kind of ashamed I haven't name-dropped him previously, as his work on all of the Obayashi projects he's done has been fantastic. Turning Point is no exception, even if it isn't quite on par with the stellar scores of Haruka Nostalgia or Samurai Kids, or Spirited Away for that matter. Even the Hisaishi scores that might not rank amongst his best work are still fantastic. All in all, Turning Point has a good sense of style and impressive editing, but on top of that, features really well fleshed out characters and themes. It's got both style and substance going for it. I also think you can kind of see this movie as being a turning point, to keep using the pun, in Obayashi's career, as a lot of the methods found here are carried over into his other work. Even the basic premise of following a reporter traveling around, getting perspectives from different people, and the constant cuts to newspaper headlines really reminded me of the setup of Casting Blossoms to the Sky, which did that format and style even better. Turning Point almost feels like a precursor to what we'd eventually see in the anti-war trilogy, both in its scathing commentaries on Japanese society and dialogue-heavy approach. The story can be kind of hard to follow because it's so complicated, intricate, and features so many characters with many different perspectives. For me though, I really enjoyed everything Turning Point had to offer and think it's another really solid outing from Obayashi. Not a bad movie to share my birthday with. Certainly better than Getting Even with Dad. Shinobugawa, in a lot of ways, is Obayashi's most minimalistic project to date, and definitely one of his most distinct. It's an adaptation of the book by the same name by Tetsuo Miura, but it's not what you would call a traditional adaptation, as it's more about the book rather than being the book. Allow me to explain what I mean by that. The story of Shinobugawa, as in the book, is about a young nameless student referred to as I, and a young waitress named Shino, who reluctantly fall in love with each other and begin a relationship. Simple concept on the surface, but the real substance of the story emerges when the characters begin talking about their traumatic backstories and what led to their general disillusionment to falling in love in the first place. Obayashi's adaptation takes place after the events of the book, with the two main characters reflecting on the story while staying at a spa in northern Japan. The protagonist reads the book, which is written in first person anyway, and Shino listens. While I haven't read the book itself, I have seen another adaptation of this story prior to this one, which was The Long Darkness, released in 1972. That was a much more traditional approach to adapting a book into a narrative feature, and it's a really good underrated film that I recommend. I was curious how this adaptation would compare to the original one, but much like Obayashi's Sada versus In the Realm of the Senses, Shinobugawa is a very different beast from The Long Darkness. At least with Sada, I can definitely say that I liked it more than In the Realm of the Senses, because I thought it was a more dynamic and mature movie that explored the title character in a more complete manner. Shinobugawa is hardly even a movie in the traditional sense, clocking in at 50 minutes and being aired on the NHK. Kind of like Russian Lullabies, you could consider this as much more of a television special than a feature film. On the surface, the concept of a man reading a book for 50 minutes probably doesn't sound like that enticing of a project, but if you're familiar with Japanese culture, you might understand the style a little bit more. The way this is presented is very similar to the style of Japanese rakugo. For those unfamiliar, rakugo are verbal performances, usually comedic in tone but sometimes dramatic, that typically feature a lone person on a stage telling a long story to an audience with minimal props or movement. While Shinobugawa isn't a rakugo in the traditional sense, there are a few similarities in its presentation that could help the uninitiated understand the approach to storytelling a little bit better. You could consider this to be the antithesis of the show-don't-tell philosophy behind a lot of movies, but that doesn't mean Obayashi doesn't give the viewers a lot to chew on visually. The film uses a lot of camera movement for emphasis to really highlight both how the narrator and Shino are experiencing the story. This is also true of the lighting, which gradually gets darker and more distinct to reflect the changing tone of the story. The cinematography really manages to get the most out of the small room that they're in, shooting it from every angle imaginable. Even the little touches like how the camera often changes when it switches between two characters' dialogues are really nice to see. There are parts of the movie that take place outdoors too, which really showcase the beautiful snowy environment that they're staying. I'm willing to bet this laid some of the groundwork for the film 7 Weeks, which was also very dialogue heavy and took place in a similar snowy environment. Beyond the visuals, Shinobugawa also uses its sound design for emphasis in a way that I find to be extremely effective. There is a lot of music in the movie which is really atmospheric and changes depending on the tone of the scene. Even more intriguing than that are the sound effects. Certain sounds come from the environment of the spa, such as the tea kettle, the ticking of the clock, and outside weather. Other sounds come from the book, such as the murmuring of people talking in crowded areas, trains passing by, or sleigh bells. It's really trippy in a way that emulates real life better than most movies, as it makes me think how the environment you're in can affect the mood of what art you're experiencing, whether that be books, movies, video games, or anything else. The two actors here, Tomokazu Miura and Kaori Takahashi, deserve a lot of credit, as the movie wouldn't work nearly as well if it wasn't for the strong performances. Miura's narration is great, and Takahashi's facial expressions when she's reacting to the story carry a lot of emotional weight. I love how Shino smiles when she hears something sweet and starts moving around the room whenever she recalls something uncomfortable. The narrator grounds this perfectly, as he usually stays straight-faced and matter-of-fact while he's reading the story, although there are moments where he'll crack a smile when he recounts a nice memory. There's so much time, thought, and care put into the nuances that you forget you're even watching two actors playing characters and see them as real people remembering the actual backstory of their relationship. This is classic Obayashi, taking a story which in itself doesn't sound too special on the surface, making it sound even more mundane by adapting it into a television film where a guy reads a book for 50 minutes, and having it turn out incredibly engaging through its unconventional presentation, pristine direction, and fantastic acting. I love how I've seen so many projects from this director, and he's still managing to surprise me. The opening and closing texts say the novel was loved for its simplicity, and I think you could say the same thing about this adaptation potentially. Simple in concept, but man does it ever leave an impact. This could have been such a boring misfire, but it really makes for a great cerebral experience that I could probably watch 10 more times, and probably will throughout the years. I'm assuming this adaptation doesn't cover every single word in the book, but it covers enough to give you a good idea of what it's like. The Long Darkness did a great job at adapting the story to the screen, if the book they're reading in Shinobugawa is any indication. I'd actually maybe recommend watching that movie before Obayashi's adaptation, as it could act like a pseudo-prequel. The Long Darkness and Shinobugawa are really worth watching, so why not check out both? That about does it for the movie reviews, but before I sign off, I would like to bring up one more thing that has perplexed me for years. It's in regard to Obayashi's film Samurai Kids, which I reviewed way back in my first video on the director. At one point in that film, we see the titular samurai playing a Super Famicom game. Uno Aphex and I searched high and low to find out what game this could possibly be, to no avail, even going as far as to upload a video on my Obayashi archive account to see if we could get any results. Uno Aphex posted the link to said video in the Rerez Discord server, where we discovered that Konami is listed in the credits of the film. Could this be a Konami game? Is it even a real game? Some have theorized that it was a prototype that wasn't finished for a samurai game that Konami was creating. If so, why and how did Obayashi get his hands on said prototype? Why not use a pre-existing game? Is it even a prototype, or is it a mock game made specifically for the movie? The question as to what exactly this is has haunted me for years, and I'm not sure I'm ever going to get an answer. Until anyone has any leads, please let us know, so I can hopefully put a cap on this part of the story. Until then, I'll see you all probably in about a year for the next Nobuhiko Obayashi update.
Hi, this is Mike the Editor. Would you like to support our channel? Please do so by watching our videos, dropping us lots of comments, good, bad, whatever you prefer. If you like this video, smash the like button with your face. If you're not subscribed already, please do so, and remember the bell icon for notifications to new videos. We also have a Patreon, which the link will be down there somewhere in the description. If you want to help us out monetarily, that'd be great. Also, the video you just watched, fair use policy, blah, 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 something, something, something. We also have a Discord server, which please come and join the chat. The link will be also in the description. We already got a lot more content in the pipeline, so please stay tuned. Thank you. Bye.